By this time, I had made the acquaintance of a greater number of 45 women in Hall 6. Let me introduce a few. Louise, the pretty German girl who I had spoken of formerly being sick with fever, had the delusion that the spirits of her dead parents were with her. "I've gotten many beatings from Miss Grady and her assistants," she said, "and I'm unable to eat the horrible food they give us. I ought not be compelled to freeze for want of proper food, proper clothing. Oh, I pray nightly that I may be taken to my papa and mamma. One night, when I was confined at Bellevue, Dr. Field came. I was in bed, and weary of the examination. At last I said, 'I'm tired of this. I will walk no more.' 'Won't you?' he said angrily. 'I'll see if I can make you.' With this he laid his crutch on the side of the bed, and getting on it, he pinched me very severely in the ribs. I jumped straight up in bed and said, 'What do you mean by this?' 'I want to teach you to obey when I speak to you,' he replied. 'If I could only die and go to papa.' When I left, she was confined to bed with fever, and maybe by this time she has her wish. There was a Frenchwoman confined in Hall 6, or was during my stay, whom I firmly believed to be perfectly sane. I watched her and talked with her every day except the last 3, and I was unable to find the delusion or mania in her. Her name was Josephine Desborough, if that was spelled correctly, and her husband and all her friends are in France. Josephine feels her position keenly. Her lips tremble, and she breaks down crying when she talks of her helpless condition. 'How did you get here?' I asked. One morning I was trying to get breakfast. I grew deathly sick, and 2 officers were called in by the woman of the house, and I was taken to this station house. I was unable to understand their proceedings, and they paid little attention to my story. Doings in this country were new to me, and before I realized it, I was lodged in an insane asylum. When I first came, I cried that I was here without hope of release, and for crying for Miss Grady and her assistants choked me until they hurt my throat, for it has been sore ever since. I had been watching and talking with a fair-complexed woman for several days, and I was at a loss to see why she had been sent there. She was so sane. 'Why did you come here?' I asked her one day after we indulged in a long conversation. 'I was sick,' she replied. 'Are you sick mentally?' I urged. 'Oh, no. What gave you such an idea?' 'I had been overworking myself, and I broke down. Having some family trouble, and being penniless and nowhere to go, I applied to the commissioners to be sent to the poorhouse until I would be able to go to work. But they did not send poor people here unless they are insane,' I said. 'Don't you know there are only insane women, or those supposed to be so, sent here?' I knew after I got here that the majority of these women were insane, but then I believed them when they told me that this place they sent all the poor who applied for aid, as I had done. 'How have you been treated?' I asked. 'Well, so far I've escaped a beating, although I've been sickened at the sight of many of the rectile more. When I was brought here at the recital of Moore, when I was brought here, they went to give me a bath, and the very disease for which I needed doctoring and from which I was suffering made it necessary that I should not bathe. But they put me in, and my sufferings were increased greatly for weeks thereafter. A Mrs. McCartney, whose husband is a tailor, seemed perfectly rational, and has not one fancy. Mary Hughes and Miss Louise Scance showed me no obvious traces of insanity. One day 2 newcomers were added to our list. The one was an idiot, carried glass, and the other was a nice-looking German girl, quite young. She seemed, and when she came in, all the patients spoke of her nice appearance and apparent sanity. Her name was Margaret. She told me she had been a cook and was extremely neat. One day, after she had scrubbed the kitchen floor, the chambermaids came down and deliberately soiled it. Her temper was aroused, and she began to quarrel with them. An officer was called, and she was taken to an asylum. 'How can they say I am insane, merely because I allowed my temper to run away with me?' she complained. 'Other people are not shut up for crazy when they get angry. I suppose the only thing to do is to keep quiet, so to avoid beatings which I see others get. No one can say one word about me. I do everything I am told and all the work they give me. I am obedient in every respect, and I do everything to prove to them that I am sane. One day an insane woman was brought in. She was noisy, and Miss Grady gave her a beating and blackened her eye. When the doctors noticed it and asked if it was done before she came there, the nurses said it was. While I was in Hall 6, I never heard the nurses address the patients except to scold or yell at them, unless it was to tease them. They spent much of their time gossiping about the physicians and about their nurses in a manner that was not elevating. Miss Grady nearly always interspersed her conversation with profane language, and generally began her sentences by calling on the name of the Lord. The names she called the patients were of the lowest and most profane type. One evening she quarreled with another nurse while we were at supper about the bread, and when the nurse had gone out she called her bad names and made ugly remarks about her. In the evenings a woman whom I supposed to be head cook for the doctors used to come up and bring raisins, grapes, apples, and crackers to the nurses. Imagine the feelings of the hungry patients as they watched the nurses eat what was to them a dream of luxury. One afternoon Dr. Dent was talking to a patient, Miss Turney, about some trouble she had had with the nurse, or matron. A short time after we were taken down to supper, this woman, who had been beaten, Miss Turney, and of whom Dr. Dent spoke, was sitting at the door of our dining room. Suddenly Miss Turney picked up her bowl of tea and was rushing out of the door, flung it at a woman who had beat her. There was some loud screaming, and Miss Turney was returned to her place. The next day she was transferred to the rope gang, which was supposed to be composed of the most dangerous and most suicidal women on the island. I want to say that the night nurse Burns in Hall 6 seemed very kind and patient for afflicted people. The other nurses made several attempts to talk to me about lovers and asked me if I would not like to have one. They did not find me very communicative on the, to them, popular subject. Once a week the patients were given a bath, and that is the only time they see soap. A patient handed me a piece of soap one day about the size of a thimble. I considered it a great compliment in her wanting to be kind, but I thought she would appreciate the cheap soap more than I, so I thanked her but refused to take it. On bathing day the tub is filled with water, and the patients are washed one after the other without a change of water. This is done until the water is really thick, and when it is allowed to run out, the tub is refilled without being washed. The same towels are used on all the women, those with eruptions as well as those without. The healthy patients fight for a change of water, but they are compelled to submit to the dictates of the lazy, tyrannical nurses. The dresses are seldom changed oftener than once a month. If a patient is a visitor, I have seen the nurses hurry her out and change her dress before the visitors comes in. This keeps up the appearances of careful and good management. The patients who are not able to take care of themselves get into beastly conditions, and the nurses never look after them, but order some of the patients to do so. For 5 days we were compelled to sit in a room all day. I never put in such a long time. Every patient was stiff and sore and tired. We would get into little groups on benches and torture our stomachs by conjuring up thoughts of what we would eat first when we got out. If I had not known how hungry they were and the pitiful side of it, the conversations would have been very amusing. As it was, it made me sad. When the subject of eating, which seemed to be the favorite one, was worn out, they used to give their opinions on the institution and its management. The condemnation of the nurses and the edibles was unanimous. As the days passed, Miss Tilly Mayard's condition grew worse. She was continually cold and unable to eat of the food provided. Day after day she sang in order to try and maintain her memory, but at last the nurse made her stop it. I talked with her daily and grieved to find her grow worse so rapidly. At last she got a delusion. She thought that it was trying to pass myself off for her, and that all people who called to see Nellie Brown were friends in search for her, but that but that I, by some means, was trying to decide them into belief that I was a girl. I tried to reason with her, but found it impossible, so I kept away from her as much as possible, lest my presence should make her worse and feed the fancy. One of the patients, Miss Cotter, a pretty, delicate woman, one day thought she was her husband coming up the walk. She left the line in which she was marching and ran to meet him. For this act she was sent to the retreat. She afterwards said, "The remembrance of that is enough to make me mad." For crying, the nurses beat me with a broom handle and jumped on me, injuring me internally, so that I shall never get over it. Then they tied my hands and feet, and throwing a sheet over my head, twisted it tightly around my throat so I could not scream. Thus put me in a bathtub filled with cold water. They held me under until I gave up every hope, became senseless, and other times they took hold of my ears and beat my head on the floor against the wall. Then they pulled out my hair by the roots so that it would never grow again. Miss Cotter here showed me proofs that her story, the dent in the back of her head, the bare spots where the hair had been taken out by handfuls, gave her story as plainly as possible. My treatment was not as bad as I have seen others get there, but it has ruined my health, and even if I do get out of here, I will be a wreck. When my husband heard of the treatment given me, he threatened to expose the place if I was not removed. So I was brought here. I am well mentally now. All that old fear has left me, and the doctor has promised to allow my husband to take me home. I made the acquaintance of Bridget McGinnis, who seemed to be sane at the present time. She said she was sent to Retreat 4 and put on the rope game. The beating I got there was something dreadful. I was pulled around by the hair, held under the water until I strangled, and I was choked and kicked. The nurses would always keep a quiet patient stationed at the window to tell them when any of the doctors were approaching. It was hopeless to complain to the doctors, for they always said it was an imagination of our diseased brains, and besides, we would get another beating for telling. They would hold patients under the water and threaten to leave them to die if they were not promised to tell the doctors. We would all promise because we knew the doctors would not help us, and we would do anything to escape the punishment. After breaking a window, I was transferred to the lodge, the worst place on the island. It was dreadfully dirty in there, and the stench was awful. In the summer, the flies swarm the place. The food is worse than we get in the other wards, and we are given only tin plates instead of the bars being on the outside, as in the ward, they are on the inside. There are many quiet patients there who have been there for years, but the nurses keep them to do the work. Among other beating I got there, the nurses jumped on me once and broke 2 of my ribs. While I was there, a pretty young girl was brought in. She had been sick. She fought against being in that dirty place. One night the nurses took her, and after beating her, they held her naked in a cold bath. Then they threw her on her bed. When morning came, the girl was dead. The doctor said she had died of convulsions, and that was all that was done about it. They inject so much morphine and chloral that the patients are made crazy. I have seen patients wild for water from the effect of drugs, and the nurses would refuse it to them. I have heard women beg for a whole night for 1 drop, and it was not given to them. I myself cried for water until my mouth was so parched and dry that I could not speak. I saw the same thing myself in Hall 7. The patients would beg for a drink before retiring, but the nurses, Miss Hart, and the others refused to unlock the bathroom, that they might quench their thirst.